Maku karakia. Tuia I runga, tuia I raro. Tuia I waho, tuia I roto. Tuia te here tangata, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao, haumie, uie, tai kie. Welcome to this Privacy Week session on what's missing from the conversation on AI. I'm James Ting-Edwards. I'm on the policy team at the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. And so I'm going to talk briefly about some work that we did. Obviously, the development and uptake of artificial intelligence, and particularly generative AI tools like ChatGPT, Midjourney, Stability, and so forth, has got a huge amount of attention over the past couple of years. I came on board with the Privacy Commissioner around this time last year, and about 6 months ago in September, we put out some guidance on, I guess a little longer, how to apply the Privacy Act to using AI, because there are those existing responsibilities. We do know that privacy is one part of the landscape, and there's other things going on as well, but that's our bit, and that's the bit that we went to lead on. We know that this is also an issue that's relevant to New Zealanders. We've just had our survey results back and published for Privacy Week, and concern around using AI to make decisions in public sector or private sector organizations. That's one of the top 3 concerns we heard identified from people in those survey results. All right. We have a fantastic panel for this conversation, and so the sooner we can get into hearing from them, the better from my perspective. We have Karaitiana Taiuru. Dr. Taiuru is a leading authority on tikanga and digital technologies, a Māori tech ethicist. We have Mandy Henk, who's the chief executive at Tohatoa, a not-for-profit that focuses on information literacy and community resilience in the face of technology and environmental challenges. And we have Allyn Robbins, who's the AI lead at Brainbox. He's a senior consultant there, and Brainbox is a public interest think tank and consultancy sitting at the intersection of technology, law, and policy, and excitingly has just gone to become a not-for-profit. So that's my introductions, but let's go around in the same order. Is there anything else you'd like to say to introduce yourself, starting with you, Karaitiana?
No, just kia ora to everybody, and yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation today. Kia ora.
Mandy?
Kia ora, same. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
And Allyn?
I'll make it a hat trick of no additions, and happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
All right, let's get into that. Okay, so what is the current state of the AI conversation in Aotearoa, and what's one thing that's missing from it? Karaitiana.
So from a TL Māori perspective, I think we've got some major privacy concerns around collective ownership of data, and actually knowing where our data is going, who has ownership or sovereignty over that data, are the big questions that I'm hearing at the moment in the community. And also, yeah, probably lots of questions from Māori organisations who don't actually know what AI does with data. And I've just literally walked across the pathway from talking about this to another group. So it's definitely a hot topic. And I think it's something that we all need to be aware of, that while we might be in our circles and AI is something that we're familiar with, we know the pros, we know the cons, but there's a lot of people who don't actually know about it. So I think getting the information out to those communities is really important.
Yes, and there's a lot of focus on what it does, not so much focus on what goes into it or how that informs what it does. How about you, Mandy? What's the state of the conversation, and what's one thing that's missing from it?
I think the state of the conversation is that it is still enormously full of hype and enormously full of marketing material, almost to the exclusion of anything else. I think that if we're looking at what's missing from the conversation, from sort of my perspective, the number one thing I would say is the voices of children and young people themselves. We've done a lot of work around AI and education, much of which has not actually been informed by the primary sort of key players in that area.
And to finish us off, Allyn, what's the state of the conversation and what's something that's missing from it?
I would agree with Mandy that there's a lot of hype in the conversation right now and in all the conversations taking place around AI, because a thing that I think is missing, it's not my one thing, but there are a lot of different conversations happening about AI right now. There's conversations happening in government, there's conversations happening within businesses, there's conversations happening in people's living rooms and kitchens, and often they're not really connected up, and they have different emphases, and important things from each can get missed in the others. But I would say the one thing that tends to be missing from most of them is a focus on what AI is right now. Often it feels like we're talking about what AI might do in a few years down the road, or if it got better at certain things. But when you look at what it is right now and what it can do right now, I think the conversation changes quite a lot, and often we're not having that conversation.
I think there's a couple of
the real and a focus on the actually existing AI of the moment, as opposed to sort of the marketing fantasies that are being sold to us.
So a couple of things there. One about the future state versus the current state. Karaitiana, do you want to say anything about that?
No, I just support both Allyn and Mandy. There's a lot of hype, and also with that hype comes a lot of fear, especially with Māori communities who already have a mistrust of government and of technology. So it's not unusual for me to hear conversations from rangatahi who are scared that the police will deploy killer robots that will be trained on Māori faces. I mean, it's not going to happen, and it's not there, but that hype, does lead to fear, which we need to address.
Yeah, and that sounds like another aspect of those potentially different conversations people are having in different spaces. So, like, what does that lead to when people have these different understandings?
Is that to anyone, or
To anyone? Go for it.
I think this is a symptom of the way that AI has been discussed for a long time, which is that it doesn't really have a set definition. There are so many terms within it. When most people say AI now, what they mean is ChatGPT or similar things to it. In the past, when people said AI, they meant something theoretical in the future that was closer to what we might think of science fictional AI, or they meant very specific technical systems that operated within specific limits. And for a while, AI was a tarnished term, and people said machine learning, and then they said algorithms. And now you could describe almost anything as AI. You could describe a spell checker, you could describe a grammar checker as AI if you wanted to. And that means that all of these different things are getting sold as AI. And because they're all using the same term, people see all of them and conflate them in ways, and it makes it harder for them to have grounded conversations about what we're seeing in front of us right now. So I think the looseness of the terminology is a big contributor to separating those different conversations out. And I think it's a looseness in terminology that benefits, some of the people operating in the space who are perhaps peddling hype. It'll benefit sometimes just people who want to kind of give you a shorthand and get things across. So I don't know that there's an easy solution besides just long-term education work and continuing to talk about these things and make it clear that all of these things are actually different, and that when we say AI, that encompasses a huge range of things.
It's something that we had to grapple with when we were thinking about how to do privacy guidance from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, because you have the catch-all term of AI, and then you have all those different systems of what information is going in. Are you predicting? Are you classifying? Does it look more like a ranking system in a social media service that is putting something to the top of someone's feed? Or does it look like something that is, from the user's perspective, like a chat GPT or an image producing tool? It feels like you're going from nothing to producing something. Is that actually what's going on under the hood? Mandy?
Under the hood of AI itself? I mean, I think that the reality with the generative AI products that is often what we're talking about now when we talk about AI is that those are in fact tools and products that have taken in the enormous amount of culture, of creation, of text, of images, of video, and a computer is processing them. The term that I like for it a lot is spicy autocorrect. And that's really, at the end of the day, what it is. It's a machine that is very good at making a prediction about what the next word, what the next pixel is going to be, but it does so in a way that is completely divorced from any kind of meaning, any kind of connection, and sort of all of the things that are actually behind human to human communication.
Okay, so I think we've set out a bit of canvas and we've mapped some territory here. But I'm always conscious that it's important to think about who's in the conversation and who's not. So let's go around again with the question: what informs your perspective on AI, and how would that inform what other people might pick up and how other people might think about it? Starting with Karaitiana.
So I do a lot of reading of international research, international activists, media articles about how AI impacts minorities, Indigenous people, people of color, basically all minority communities. And so, I take that reading and that understanding, and then I apply it back to a Te Ao Māori perspective and try and calculate or predict what the risks would be for Māori. And so that's how my perspective's informed.
And how about you, Mandy?
I think that there are so many different AI conversations happening right now, but only some of them are being given sort of media attention. Only some of them have the power to really project outwards. And in terms of the ones that I think have been less listened to, less heard, I think if we're looking at the sort of art community, both visual artists and authors, I think that their sort of needs haven't really had the same impact for those particularly whose work is not commercial in nature. I think we've certainly heard from the publishers, but I think we have heard less from people who do this sort of creation without a financial goal at the end of the day. I think children, who I've already mentioned, not simply advocates for children, but children and young people themselves. And I think that there is also a sort of world of people who very much would like to live a less digital lifestyle, a lifestyle that's more sort of centered in the physical world. And that whole entire perspective is almost completely absent. So people who would like to be able to opt out of this and make different lifestyle choices simply aren't included in the conversation at all as a legitimate perspective.
Cool. And Allyn, what informs your perspective, and how might other people draw on that?
I consider myself, very privileged in general, but also in entering this conversation, in that my father is a computer science professor who has been doing stuff on AI for a long time. So I've kind of grown up around these things and watched the field develop from a distance initially. But I've had opportunities to play with early builds of things and seen how the field as a whole has grown over the course of my whole life. And that, I think, helps to ground me in terms of, it feels, I think, for a lot of people, like AI kind of came out of nowhere, or this current round of generative AI really just suddenly appeared. And that progress has been incredibly rapid. And of course, it's going to continue being that rapid when, if you look at the long tail, this is the product of work that was done over decades. And development has been not steady, but not nearly as explosive as I think it can feel sometimes. And it's also a useful reminder to me that these AI systems are the products of work by an enormous number of people, and they're physical systems. Mandy was talking about it feeling like AI can give you something out of nothing. And yes, she makes the point that actually there's an enormous amount of data scraped often from people who didn't necessarily know that was going to be happening and wouldn't be comfortable with it to inform the system. But it's also the product of an enormous number of people being paid, usually below minimum wage, to sit there and label data for hours and hours and hours, or to evaluate the responses of a system for hours and hours. And a lot of the time when AI systems improve, or they appear to improve. There's an embarrassing failure that ChatGPT is making, for instance, and then it stops making that. It's not necessarily that the system itself has gotten better. It's that a bunch of contractors have been paid $2 an hour to throw more training into the system until it stops doing that. And this whole process uses enormous server banks and enormous amounts of power and costs a lot, both environmentally and just in raw cash amounts. All large AI companies, or all companies that are providing access to those foundational models that other people build on, are hemorrhaging money right now. And I think that's something that is often lost in the discussion, because they're offering their product at a loss to try and make their way to a business model. And people are behaving as though it's always going to be as available and as appealing an option for them to engage with commercially as it currently is. And I don't think that's going to necessarily be the case. So how other people could learn in the same way, I think, is just always remember that these systems don't come out of nowhere. They're not just fully digital and ethereal. They are built by people. They're maintained by people. People feed into them at every stage, and there are consequences from that.
Yeah, I think that recentering people is also a really important thing from a privacy perspective. So I think some of the same natures of discussion can go on where it seems very abstract. We're talking about privacy. It feels like we're talking about records and databases. And in fact, there's people on all sides of those transactions, and there's also physical privacy. So there's been discussions elsewhere in the week around biometrics. There are discussions around when you have ubiquitous sensors in the physical world, that interacts with these systems as well. And we've got to remember that privacy is also about us being in physical space, maybe face to face. I should also briefly mention, obviously, I'm here hosting for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, and here in that capacity and bring that perspective. I also, as at least Mandy and Karaitiana know, historically worked in internet governance, broadly construed, and that's a field where there's a lot more imperfect but awareness of multi-stakeholder governance involving academics and hobbyist technologists and communities, as well as businesses and governments. And that's an interesting thing to think about that is not necessarily so prominent in the AI conversation. Let's take that as a jumping off point. We've already heard some things about international developments. What might people not be aware of or should be more aware of in terms of international developments? And that could be in terms of regulation or the technology itself. Starting again with you, Karaitiana.
Oh, there's a big question. I think there's lots of work going on in terms of regulation. It's hard to keep up sometimes. I mean, I don't even know where to start on that question, but I think nationally, from a Te Ao Māori perspective, there's a lot of us that are looking at Māori data sovereignty principles and how they can be applied to AI, yet how they also don't quite fit into the Privacy Act. And so there's those conversations are happening about how do we move forward from this, and how do we respect Te Tiriti o Waitangi and Te Ao Māori with the Privacy Act, with AI. So they're ongoing conversations. I think, there's obviously regulation occurring, like in the EU. China have made some progress. Various countries have as well, but I think I'll just leave it at that national point and pass it on.
Yeah, and that point around thinking in terms of group interests, I personally think that's potentially really interesting in the context of these systems, where it's not always clear that the key operation is about one person's records affecting that one person. The technology itself is much more about comparisons and potentially thinking in terms of relational approaches or group approaches is really productive, just as a lens on how this technology works. So great point. All right, Mandy, are there any international developments that you'd like to raise, or technology developments?
Yeah, I think that there's some really interesting conversations going on overseas where the process of regulating AI is a little bit more along that sort of pathway than it is here. I think the EU and actually also Canada have some really great sort of debates happening. One of the ones that I think is really, really interesting is the question around balancing privacy and safety, particularly when you're working with young people, when you're working with AI that might have some role to play in mental health, and the sort of question of how do you decide what the obligation is of the company behind an AI, because of course an AI cannot have responsibility because it does not have agency. But what is the responsibility of these companies when they are forming what are perceived by the users as interpersonal relationships, right? So if you have a young person, if you have someone who is in distress because they're having a mental health challenge, at what point is there an obligation to act on behalf of their safety? And how does that interact with their rights to privacy? That's one of the really interesting conversations going on, particularly around the whole world of AI-enabled toys for children, right? So that's something that we don't talk about a lot here. But if all of a sudden you are putting what is essentially a surveillance tool that is interactive in some way into a child's bedroom, even in some cases into an actual crib, how do you balance that privacy versus safety question? So I think that's one of the really interesting ones. The other one that I think is farther advanced overseas than here is the question around AI and climate change. We know that the amount of power, the amount of water being used by these systems is rapidly, rapidly growing and putting considerable pressure on local and regional ecosystems. So is that something we want to do? How do we want to manage that? I think those are probably the most interesting to me conversations happening overseas right now.
Yeah, just on that first one, OpenAI this week have announced GPT 4.0, and that one of the big selling points is that it presents as a much more human conversational interface to interact with. The step of imagining that in the context where you've got kids interacting with the system obviously puts a different light on that. And we have a project underway on children and young people's privacy, acknowledging that's an important area. Allyn, are there any specific international or technological developments you wanted to point to?
I think I've said my main technological thing, which is that right now we are in a very unusual moment for the technology where it is kind of being offered at subsidized rates. I'd add also that fundamentally what generative AI is as Mandy kind of said, it's a big word that it's a big machine that puts words or pixels or whatever else together how they've been put together before, which means that it fundamentally can't do or is not designed to do a lot of the things that people imagine it doing in the future, which rely on it being trustworthy and kind of having the idea of facts and knowing things and reasoning in ways. It can appear to do that, but it can appear to do that because language is incredibly powerful. And when you apply a whole bunch of statistics to a whole bunch of language, you can do some really incredible things. But fundamentally, I don't think pouring more money and more development into this technology is going to get us to true reasoning. And that's kind of where a lot of people seem to feel that we are inevitably going to end up in a few years. And I would say if there's one technological thing I would like people to know, it's that I disagree. I don't think we're going to end up there along this line of development. If there's one international thing, I think there are a lot of regulatory responses to AI happening around the world. We've talked briefly about the EU AI Act. There's stuff happening in China. There's been stuff suggested in the US, although who knows what's going to happen with any of that. But I think it's tempting to look at that on the surface and go, they're figuring it out. or they're much further down the road on these conversations than we are. But if you delve into what those regulations actually look like, there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of flex. There are a lot of conversations about what it even looks like when you try to put it into practice that they're going to need to have. And those are conversations that are going to affect everybody else in the world because these are such big, important jurisdictions. And they're conversations that I think we as individuals and as a nation can and should be engaged with because we've got valuable things to say and they're going to affect us anyway, so we may as well be involved.
All right. Kia ora tātou. Thank you, everyone. I think this is a good point to I think we've touched on who's missing from the conversation already. So I think we can go into some Q&A. So we have a good number of questions coming through. Reminder to people out there, if you have questions, pop them in the Q&A function on Zoom. Emma, our wonderful comms and events manager, is also our comms engagement manager, is also looking at the chat. So to start with, here's a question from Angie Webster. We have inequities across the motu with those who don't have access to their own device or internet access to knowledge on what is what. For example, scam education. These groups are becoming even more isolated as new and evolving technologies are introduced. How might we address inequity across technology access and knowledge of new digital tools and tech where there are implications across context for all users? Is there anyone who'd like to start us off with a response to that? How are we going to address tech inequities?
I think that I will go ahead and sort of take an initial take at this. Number one, I think that we need to recognize that what we are asking individuals and families to do in terms of the expectations of the tech hardware that they are maintaining for their families is frankly excessive, right? Particularly if you're looking at a family that has multiple children, what you need is each kid probably needs a phone in order to participate fully in what is happening within the world of young people. They probably need a computer of some sort in order to go to and from school with. And they're probably going to want some sort of gaming system. And maybe it's time for us to recognize that it shouldn't actually be on families themselves to provide all of that in all cases. I think that what we should go back to is having better funding through either schools or other agencies to just straight up provide families with this technology. If we're going to go through all that we've gone through in order to create a world where to participate fully, you now have to have these devices, we should be funding that as fully as possible. Which I guess is just please give people money and devices is the answer to that. Someone have a more nuanced answer?
I think some of the real issues are that many of our families can't afford food. They can't afford the basics. Yet, we're talking about these inequities. Those inequities have never been solved from the late 1990s when it comes to internet access and computers. And I mean, I was involved with the digital divide questions back in the late 1990s. And even the families say the same thing back then as they say now. We don't need that technology. We've got what we need here. I can't justify X amount of dollars for that technology. My children can go to school and learn. So yeah, I think there's a balancing act here. It's more of a society issue and trying to get those priorities right. So if you've got a family that lives rurally, families that live rurally, they probably don't want AI. Then if we do bring the technology into families, then we need to up our game with cyber safety. We need to look at the long-term costs. There's a whole lot of questions that, as I said, have never been answered. And I still don't know the answer.
I think one thing I would sort of add to this, and I say this as someone who has I'm like the old woman in the shoe in terms of the number of kids around here, but we should be able to expect that these devices are durable over a much longer term. The idea that we are going to be on a 3 or even a 5-year cycle for replacing expensive computers and phones is nuts. We should have the right to repair them. And as a baseline expectation, we should easily expect, what, 7, 10 years for something that we're paying a couple of $1,000 for. It shouldn't be treated as disposable. And I think that the manufacturers are desperately trying to get us to treat our technology as fundamentally disposable.
Okay. A different direction, a question from someone in the chat. Do you imagine that AI and privacy regulation would be under one regulator or be separated? And perhaps there are models internationally that you might have in mind. I know this is an early developing area. Allyn, is that something you have a view on?
As in specifically AI and like privacy with regards to AI regulation, or AI and privacy regulation?
Good question. So is there a bespoke AI regulator? Is it AI and privacy? Is it something else?
I don't think that a bespoke AI regulator is really what's needed. I think like with any technology, you should be looking at how the technology is developed and how it's used and what it's used for, rather than trying to legislate the technical details of it at that level. It's just a tool. Regulate what people do with the tool, and if individual kind of versions of the tools become too particularly dangerous, then you can address those in the areas that they are having effects. So Office of the Privacy Commissioner seems to be a pretty reasonable place to have discussions about AI and privacy specifically, but I don't think that AI would need to sit in any one place, because it's a technology that touches a lot of things, and so it's going to be necessary for a lot of things to touch it, if that doesn't get too weird a mixed metaphor vibe. And this is
Mandy.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
I just want to add, kind of leading on from the last question about digital equity and that sort of thing. I think this speaks to a larger issue that there is a tendency to talk about digital technologies in general, but especially AI, as if they are somehow a completely different category to everything else, that when you involve AI, suddenly that's fundamentally different to anything we've ever dealt with before. It's the same. You know, the digital inequities have the same kinds of sources and the same kinds of solutions as the inequities that we have seen for longer than digital stuff has been around. Regulating AI, you know, there are new challenges with the technology, but the core problems and the core things that people would do with AI that might be issues are going to be the same problems and issues that we have had for a long time. I don't think it necessarily calls for us to completely alter our approach just for this specific technological iteration.
Thank you. And for those who've been following what the Privacy Commissioner has been saying, he's been talking about the potential need to reform the privacy framework that we have, and it's in a context where changes due to AI are one of the things that's happening in the background. I have a question here. I've been looking into Māori data sovereignty and what this looks like. Does this involve any information being captured being given back to Māori hands to look after? And if so, how? Also, regardless of cultural concerns, what information is being captured? Is it voice recognition, facial recognition, stringing together thought patterns, and where is this stored? How is it sold and traded? I'm wondering if you'd like to start off with a response to that, Karaitiana.
Yep, sure. So the key principles of Māori data sovereignty is that you work in partnerships with Māori communities, whether it's iwi or hapu or organisations. And in terms of AI, I mean, ideally, Māori would be looking at the algorithms, looking at the outputs, looking at the data, verifying everything, and having that true partnership to avoid biases and to avoid that Eurocentric perspective, which is being forced upon us in technology right now. There is, so we're sort of very new part of data sovereignty being implemented, but there's not that many great examples to mention. But the key thing is to work with Māori and be transparent with what data you have, where it's stored, and the outputs that any AI is having.
Yeah, and there's obviously there are distinct concerns from a Māori data sovereignty perspective. That also is consistent with some of the general good practice in terms of understanding training data and being transparent with your stakeholders. Mandy, do you have anything specific to say on that one?
In terms of Maori data sovereignty, I think that one of the things that this sort of need highlight is the need for New Zealand to be very active in this policy space. If the Crown is going to be able to fulfill its treaty obligations to Maori, they absolutely have to be working with the companies who are producing these tools to make sure that those rights are respected at the very beginning. So I think that our particular obligations under the treaty obligate us to be highly active in this space and obligate the government to do as much as possible to facilitate engagement as it needs to happen internationally, which means resources. Like resourcing has absolutely got to be a key part of this.
Thank you. And just seen a reminder pop up. I went along to an excellent seminar on Māori data sovereignty as part of Privacy Week on Monday, and that's available online as a video. There's a related question. Is there an issue with AI and cultural colonization in the form of taking or scraping without acknowledgement or conversation with the people you're taking from? For anyone who'd like to pick that up.
I mean, yes. So I wrote a book on libraries and climate change in 2014. It was part of a very large number of books from multiple publishers that were taken into OpenAI's data set. There was actually, I think it was either a leak or a release, sort of revealing all of the titles that were included in that. No one asked me. I never would have consented to it. In this particular case, it wasn't even something that I put on social media and it was like, well, throwing it out there into the world. And I think that lots and lots and lots of creators across lots and lots of demographic and geographic communities feel the same way. The ability to take the work of creators without their consent, without any way to opt out, has been just super cheeky on their part. And it's something that I think it's really important we, get some sort of handle over.
Any other responses on this one?
Yeah, it's a major issue, especially for Te Ao Māori. We're seeing AI scraping the internet's dubious Māori data, Māori information. And I mean, the trials that I've done is quite horrific. The key message, or the key story I keep on referring to, is I asked ChatGPT what is the Māori epistemology of creation, and it gave me a translated into Te Reo Māori version of the Book of Genesis from the King James Bible. So if I didn't know any different, I could have suspected that was the case. We're seeing Māori willingly providing data and information to AI, and seeing new AI being created, new data being created that is either offensive or totally incorrect. And I think, this is something that's going to happen to all cultures. So it's a real issue.
Go ahead, Allyn.
Yeah, this leads on from us talking about what AI fundamentally is, which is generative AI, a tool for reproducing statistical relationships. So it's a machine that is guaranteed by its structure to produce more of what you've already got, reproduce stereotypes, reproduce anything that there is a lot of content of. And so in terms of cultural colonization, it's not just taking without asking, it is representing the most statistically median version of what is in its training set, and that is mostly especially when you're working in English and with what these companies have been able to scrape from what's on the internet. And to be on the internet, you've got to be past some level of wealth, you've got to have some level of privilege to just access that at all. It's a disproportionately weird the acronym, I think it's white European, I forget the other things that stands for, but it is not at all a representative sample of the world's information and the world's perspectives. And that can put people who are not part of that group in a very awkward position where either you give over your data to these things in the hopes that it makes them better, but at the cost of you giving this thing the ability or the benefit of being able to reproduce and draw on this stuff that you've produced to no real benefit to you. Or you withhold it and those models continue to reproduce what they've got already, which may be wildly incorrect and may be wildly offensive and give people an incorrect idea of what you are all about.
So you've re-upped the topic of these tools being statistical models that reproduce things out of data. I think that might relate to one of the questions we have, which is, why are people on the panel not convinced that this is going to lead to more general reasoning capabilities? Some people out there think that this approach, it can feel very human to interact with. You produce words, it produces words, that feels like a conversation. What would stop this generating something with reasoning capabilities of the kind we'd expect from another person?
So I'll say we are going to produce something that looks like it can think long before we produce anything that can actually think. And we as humans are wired to search for other minds and other communicating beings. And it's not new that there are things that we've created something that kind of seems like it can think. The idea that a chatbot is alive was originally called the Eliza effect, and it's named after a chatbot that was produced in the 90s that most definitely was not reasoning. It was just kind of spitting out garbled fragments of chats other people had with it in a similar way to what large language models do now, but much less sophisticated. And people would interact with that and would, some of them, swear that it was actually reasoning, that it was actually carrying out conversations, when it verifiably, because it was simple enough that you could dissect exactly where all the relationships were, wasn't doing that. Language is a truly incredible thing. It is designed to it was developed for humans to express reasoning and to communicate with each other, and it has all of these relationships of meaning and inference built into it. And that means that when you apply statistical techniques, you're going to pull those bits of buried reasoning and inference and association back out of it. But that doesn't mean the system is making those connections itself. It's just statistically uncovering them where they lay in the language in the first place. And because a lot of interactions with humans have happened in the training set that's been fed back into this, it is capable of reproducing what feel like very human interactions. It's capable of reproducing what seem like very human chains of logic. But that's all it's doing. It's just reproducing those things that are in its training set in slightly different ways. If you give it something completely novel, or if you give it something that is enough like what's in there just tweaked, it falls apart. It can't generalize as well. A good example of this, and this may have been fixed because it was going around and was probably embarrassing for OpenAI, so they would have made an effort to try and correct this. There's the old question, what's heavier, a ton of feathers or a ton of lead? And obviously they weigh the same, they're both a ton. There are so many explanations of that you can find on the internet that for quite a while, if you typed into ChatGPT, what's heavier, a ton of feathers or 2 tons of lead, it would explain to you that actually they weigh the same, you see, because it's just drawing on all those statistical relationships. It's not actually reasoning. And it would provide you with the reasoning that you would see for the 1 ton thing. So I think it is entirely understandable to look at what's coming out of this and conclude that it feels like there's reasoning happening there. But that's because it is kind of the perfect thing to trick us into thinking that there is. And if you delve deeper and if you try and trip it up in ways, I think you'll find ways in which it breaks that something actually thinking and reasoning wouldn't. And that's fundamental to the kind of system these large language models are. I don't think that it's necessarily impossible to build an AI system that thinks, but I think that this is not the road that takes us there.
I think, though, that it's worth sort of stepping back and sort of dissecting not necessarily this particular question, but the question of reasoning and AI in general. Because I think a lot of times what people are really asking is, are we able to create something that should have moral standing? And I think at the end of the day, the question around reasoning is much more about that. Are we able to create something that has an experience of the world? Are we able to create essentially another being? And I think it's really important to sort of say, we don't necessarily know what it is that makes something worthwhile in the world. And that is deeply, deeply cultural dependent. I think that there are all kinds of people in the world, myself included, who attribute all kinds of feelings and agency and communicative powers to, for example, this lovely teacup, which I'm in a deep emotional relationship with. But that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with anything beyond the hype. Essentially, the companies responsible for this are taking that willingness of human beings to be in relationship with all kinds of things, and they're using it to manipulate us to get us to support their products.
I'm going to mash together a couple of questions. So there's one about hallucination. Generative AI has been seen to create incorrect facts when preparing its responses. There was a colleague's CV that contained pure fabrications. And then there's also problems where there's a lot of current use to create non-consensual images of people, including intimate images. So you've got a set of problems where you have incorrect information, correct information about people that shouldn't be out there, and some merging of the two. How are we going to respond to this? What's an example of a problem, and is there anything we can do about
To unmesh your question a little bit, I think those are two quite separate issues. They are both examples of these systems kind of doing what they're designed to. And as I don't want to do the whole spiel again, but it just reproduces statistical relationships. It doesn't know whether things are true or not. So hallucinations are just the system working entirely as designed, and you can try and build structures around the systems to make that less likely or to catch them. But fundamentally, the system at its core is going to produce them, and there's not a lot you can do about that. You can try to mitigate it, but that's all. Non-consensual intimate images generated by AI are, again, it's the system doing what it's designed to, but it's producing what people want to, and what they want to do with it is awful. And that, I think, is something that can be targeted. It should be targeted legally. Yep. New Zealand's parliament has had multiple opportunities to officially declare that non-consensual AI images of people are illegal to produce, and it hasn't done that so far. And I think that that's a slam dunk. Yes, that should be illegal. And, you can talk about ways to enforce that, but at base, I hope we can all agree you shouldn't be allowed to do that to somebody.
Yeah, and there's a couple of in the privacy framework, probably inaccurate information about someone could well be personal information, but I think you're also talking about the harmful digital communications framework, where there was a process on intimate visual recordings that probably went a little bit narrower. So we've got some people who are feeling a bit sad and cynical in the questions. I can't shake the thought that the vested interest in the AI sphere, military, corporate, billionaires, could care less about privacy, data sovereignty, etc. Is there a realistic way to address these issues without massive societal change?
No.
Mandy, I think you've been thinking about related issues.
Yes. No, there is not, and we need massive societal change. It's a short answer.
And I think from a New Zealand perspective, we're unique where we do have Te Tiriti o Waitangi. We did sign up to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We've got some groundwork there which we can start to work on. There's a lot of activities to have Te Tiriti and all free trade agreements, especially with e-commerce. We had the Waitangi Tribunal make a decision on e-commerce, that Māori need to be engaged with algorithms, with that data of the taonga, that Māori data is subject to sovereignty. And I think as a small country, we can start making some steps and actually force some of these big companies to recognize our our uniqueness. It's not going to solve the problem, but I think there's a few steps that we could do as a country.
I agree, and I'll add that I think there have been certain practices and expectations around privacy and data privacy that have kind of gotten accepted and ingrained with people operating online that they wouldn't have accepted in their personal, physical, day-to-day lives. And as real life increasingly moves online for some people, and as tech products like augmented reality and facial recognition start to move more into the real world, we are seeing kind of a more of a merging of the physical and digital in people's experiences, and they're starting to encounter the expectations of privacy that have been ingrained in the digital world, in the physical world, and they don't like it because it draws into sharp relief for them what that actually means. And I think now is an opportunity perhaps for us to look at all of those norms that have been ingrained and go, okay, so now that we all are more on the same page and we know what this actually means, do we want this? If we don't want this, how do we change it? What do we do about it? So I try to be optimistic, and I think that there is a chance for there to be a wider spread moment of clarity about what we actually want privacy in general to look like in a increasingly digital age.
You try to be optimistic. There's a comment in the questions that someone would like you, Allyn, to come along and join the conversations where other people say they're being too cynical. Next question. Gen AI is a shiny new toy for both adults and young people. How do you suggest we help the rest of society to be more aware about the data implications of Gen AI, given not everyone's as tech savvy or enthusiastic about data and privacy protection? Karaitiana.
So for me, it's engaging with Māori communities and telling them about where data is stored, how it's used, data brokers, privacy, data sovereignty, te obligations. And I keep on reinforcing the fear that our mātauranga Māori, our knowledge, we're always worried it's going to be stolen. But if we're going to be putting it into Gen AI, we're just willingly giving it away. So, and then I also, with the communities, I try and make it as plain English as possible. And I also use like a te ao Māori perspective. I use metaphors, I use our own epistemology to talk about AI and the risks. And I also say that every issue that AI causes, we can look at our traditional knowledge, and and there's a warning about that already. So that's how I try and interact with Māori communities, at least.
And Mandy?
I think that there's a need for community education on this topic that isn't delivered by vested interests. I think that as much as possible, getting people to understand the actual technology, not the sort of hype imaginary, is really, really crucially important. And good, solid community technical education is probably one of the best ways of achieving that right now, as well as a larger understanding around the political economy of these tools.
Yeah, and the impacts of things people are doing in response. So someone's said read devices in schools. Ironically, schools are currently struggling to accurately assess students' learning because of the availability of generative AI tools. And they're now requiring people to go back to handwritten supervised writing, which creates its own problems for students with learning difficulties, neurodivergent children, and so forth. Anyone want to jump off that? Mandy?
I think that this is a time to really reconsider the role that digital technologies have been playing in our classrooms and whether they have delivered what was promised. I mean, we've had at this point close to 10 years of getting these devices heavily in schools and into the sort of pedagogical process. And I think it's very, very reasonable for us to question now, have they actually delivered what was promised? And maybe consider reevaluating the role that they're playing in terms of being enormous sinks for significant amounts of financial investment, and whether in fact we need to bring some more balance to it so that we're using a range of different technological tools, and not only these sort of laptops and tablets, as well as making sure that we're teaching kids skills that maybe we have a generation of kids who they missed. Things like being able to handwrite competently, for example, and being able to find information in traditional books. My "let's teach everyone to use the table of contents and the index again" message is admittedly less popular than the AI related messages. And yet.
So I was going to go around and see if we would each like to recommend something that people could look at, but we've got a question that I'm going to use to do that. So who are the right sources of information in terms of education? Do you all have recommendations around podcasts or reliable sources to get that education? So if anyone's got something top of mind, what would you recommend? And then we'll go around.
I think there's some excellent critical technology podcasts for this space. Paris Marks, Mel Hogan. What's the name of Emily Bender's?
Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000 from the Distributed AI Research Institute.
Yeah, I mean, these are some of the best sources that I have found to learn about AI, and I would encourage people to engage with them.
Karaitiana, I see from the questions, unfortunately, we haven't been able to get to everyone, but you were on a podcast recently, so that's possibly a good source, and the person who hosted it is enthusiastic to see you here.
Yep, definitely. And also next week, there's going to be a soft launch of an AI resource list. So if you go to tiaomaori.ai next week, it should come up. And so that's it might be there now, but it should be next week. It's going to be available. That'll have a whole lot of like AI ethics, AI principles, podcasts, people to follow, Indigenous Māori rights and issues with AI. There's a whole lot of stuff in there. So definitely, keep an eye on that next week.
Allyn, do you have anything particular that you'd like to point people to?
Yeah, I'd recommend there's a book called The Atlas of AI, which deals with AI as physical systems and goes out and talks to some of the people who are training them and who work in the data centers. That I think is a helpful reminder again that these things are built and not just appear like digital constructions. I think for day-to-day news, sites that I go to fairly regularly, 404 Media does some good investigations into AI stuff. The Verge can be quite good. MIT Tech Review also, more technically grounded than some others. Not perfect by any means, but still good places to go. And I would encourage you to get a range of sources if you're looking at this on a day-to-day basis.
And you've all reminded me, there's a book from a few years ago called "You Look Like a Thing and I Love You," which is sort of cartoons looking at the kinds of models that are now much more prominent and much more widely used, but was early on some of the tendencies, like they would see giraffes in every image when there were no giraffes. Recommend that one. All right, we are coming up on time. I want to thank again our panelists, respect your time and respect the time of the audience. I'm so sorry that we couldn't get to the questions, but it's great that people are so interested. And let me karakia us out and back to the rest of our days. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia wātea aiteara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai, haumie, huie, tāikie. Thank you very much, everyone.